Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Today, we've got two food books for you. Not cookbooks, but instead they're books that help explain the food ecosystem we have today. In a bit, if your TikTok feed is anything like mine, you are bombarded by food influencers nonstop. But we'll hear about an early pioneer in the food content game, one that helped popularize Chinese food with Americans. But first, consider the chili. It can obviously add heat to a dish, sure, but it can also be a useful tool to examine the history of Mesoamerica. That's exactly what food writer Victor M. Valle does in the book The Poetics of Fire, Metaphors of Chili Eating in the Borderlands. And he talks to Here and Now's Deepa Fernandes about why we talk about the pain our brains receive from chilies in terms of heat, and what that has to do with the history of Native people. That's ahead.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Shopify. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sell without needing to code or design. Just bring your best ideas and Shopify will help you open up shop. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/NPR.
In Victor Valle's new book, The Poetics of Fire, Metaphors of Chile Eating in the Borderlands, we learn the rich history of the humble chile from ancient Mexico to the present, a key ingredient in the lives of so many today. The simple fruit, or is it a vegetable, has its genetic roots dating back 7,000 years, maybe even more, as documented by indigenous peoples of Mexico. Valle tells a fascinating story that starts with pre-Hispanic science and knowledge born from the simple chile, and it endures. Still today, the chile is a fundamental part of Mexican cuisine. In these divisive times, the chile can be a metaphor for understanding the shared cultural histories of Latinos and Chicanos from ancient times to today. To tell us more, I'm joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and professor Victor Valle. He's joining us by Skype. Victor, welcome.
Hello.
So, Victor, the chile is super unique in the deep variety and flavors and picanteness. Can you give us a brief history of how the chile came to be so important in ancient Mexico?
Well, sometime around 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, people began collecting it. During about a 2,000-year process, they began selecting varieties. So they're going into the bush, so to speak, and bringing back varieties. And those seeds are getting into the middens or their trash heaps in their neighborhoods or wherever they are. And they're growing, and then people begin to select a process and picking the ones they like. They think now that that process began in the region of what is now eastern Oaxaca. Over a 2,000-year period, domesticated varieties begin to emerge.
I mean, you describe how the native people then, the Nahua people, had a whole system for grading the spiciness, the picanteness of the chile. Can you describe that?
Basically, they had about, 8 or 9 terms. It's kind of like their version of the Scoville scale. The Scoville scale is what we use now, where you measure the strength of the chili through its dilution in water. But they had 8 or 9 terms. In the book, I give all the terms where they say hotter, 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 hotter still. And so we know that because a lot of their records were chronicled or preserved, but other native peoples in Mesoamerica were doing the same thing. The people, for example, the people of the La Cañada region are the ancestors of the Mixtec and Zapotec people today. A lot of different communities were involved in this.
Yeah, and I mean, that leads to this neuroscience that indigenous people were utilizing, very sophisticated thinking pre the idea of neuroscience even existing per se. Explain what you know about the chile and this early neuroscience that was being used.
Recent studies, and this has been going on for some time now, have isolated what is called TRPV1, which is this nerve receptor embedded in each taste bud. And this TRPV1, this receptor is really important now. Two fellows who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago realized that this nerve receptor was part of how we experience our embodiment, where it's called proprioception. There are others, how we feel gravity, how we feel movement. For Native people, they were talking about chili as heat. In the first chapter, I talk about the story goes back to around 800, 700 AD, and where the metaphors of chili are explained in terms of heat. Well, TRPV1 is a nerve receptor that tells us that when we eat chili, we are experiencing heat. Now, it's not actual heat. It's like fake heat because it's tricking our body to think, oh, this is painful, it is hot, we shouldn't eat it.
So interesting.
But for the ancient people, they were very aware that their metaphors or their perception of the experience was explained in terms of heat.
Yeah, so then I want to ask you, obviously chiles are a very sensory experience. So from the taste that you just described, anything from mild to, well, explosive. Then there are the aromas of roasting chiles that, you know, the nose just can't avoid. The zing to the eyes when chiles are being smoked or simmered. Even the tingle on the fingertips when maybe chopping or handling chiles. And that can be too much for some people. But I have to say for Mexicanos and others like us South Asian Indians, we love them. And I wonder if you have a theory as to how chiles came to be so deeply embedded in the culture and cuisine of pre-Hispanic Mexico.
Yes. When people are gathering chilies, they're gathering wild chilies. And those wild capsicum anums are extremely hot, but their sensation fades quickly. The other thing we know from, I think, and I give the exact date, so I could get the date wrong here, but as I think 3,000 years ago, they found cave middens in which they had evidence of 7 different varieties of chili. So over a matter of a rather short period of time, people are using different strains of chili for different purposes. And a lot of the things that we think would be modern uses of chili, dry chili, green chili, were already known that many thousand years ago.
Well, that leads me to asking you about present day Mexican cooks. I mean, present day, I mean, even say going back to your grandmother, who you've talked about, used her tiny little yard in Los Angeles to recreate the plains of her home in Chihuahua, where she grew chiles and then taught your mum how to roast and peel and seed and use them in traditional cooking. And I'm just wondering, make that connection for us to how, you know, something that was such a deep part of ancient Mexico then travels through immigrant families to present-day Los Angeles.
I mean, it's like an ongoing process. But what's interesting is it begins in the 16th century when Spain sets about to colonize what we call the Southwest. So this has been a continual process where seeds are brought up and planted and tested. At the table, the chili experience can have 2 completely different interpretations. One of them is for children who bite their nails. I remember they would put the vinegar from chiles en escabeche, which are pickled chilies, on the finger. So that was telling, okay, in this context, this is pain. But at the same table, we would be eating, and I remember my mother would make food that would be rather bland for us. And we would aspire to eat like the grown-ups. So that was one of that sort of very complex negotiation of contextual meaning. In one context, it's pain. In the other context, we want to be grown-ups. We want to know what everybody else is knowing. So that is an ongoing process. But as you were mentioning, this is immigrants today, all kinds of immigrants from Oaxaca continue to arrive in the borderlands. In California, for example, we have a large Oaxaca native community here, and they are planting and growing varieties, testing varieties, adapting their food. We have very large and active farmers markets here in my area where I live in San Luis Obispo, and you can go there and you can see a process of people recreating all of their cuisines.
So, Victor, end for us with maybe a little use of your metaphor. Continue that with the chile to when I think about the times that we're living in right now, which really, when it comes to ideas of immigration and who can be here and how people come here, you know, it's very divisive. And I feel like the case you make is that the chile is actually something that unites us and bonds us. Is there anything in that as we head into this very contentious election year, one might say?
Oh, that's a big question. I will just go back to the beginning of the introduction where I quote this great Oaxacan cook. She's quite famous. And she talks about her kitchen as a loom. At first I thought, well, this is just a beautiful metaphor, but I didn't realize that her metaphor is one of many the native Mesoamerican and other native people of the Southwest think of in what we call in relational terms, in ecological terms, of everything being related to everything else. So when she was talking about that, it was a different way of experiencing our presence here and relating to other people. And a very powerful metaphor. And it's also a metaphor we can use to develop a practice of daily living, of instead of seeing harsh divisions between borders and people and genders and this and that, we can say everything is related.
Great note to end on. Victor Valle is a Pulitzer-winning journalist and professor emeritus from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in California. Victor, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Sattva. Sattva luxury mattresses are every bit as elegant as the most expensive brands, but because they're sold online, they're about half the price. Visit SAATVA.com/NPR and save an additional $200. This message comes from The New Yorker. What makes a short story work? Explore the minds of writers like Ottessa Moshfegh and George Saunders on the New Yorker Fiction Podcast to find out. Listen to the New Yorker Fiction Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Food TV personalities play a huge role in how we understand cooking, cultures, and cuisine. Think about like Anthony Bourdain or Ming Tsai or Jacques Pepin. Michelle T. King's new book, Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn, is about the TV personality Fu Pei-mei. And she talked to NPR Scott Simon about how a woman who didn't even broadcast in America still managed to have a massive influence on Americans through Chinese immigrants.
Picture a woman who becomes a TV star in 1962, teaching people how to cook one of the world's great cuisines. Nope, not Julia Child. It's Fu Pei-mei. Fu Pei-mei appeared on Taiwan television for 40 years. Her 1969 cookbook, published with recipes in Mandarin and English, is still considered a classic of Chinese cookery. Michelle T. King has a new book about the life and the persisting influence of Fu Pei-mei. It's called Chop, Fry, Watch, Learn. And Michelle T. King, an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, joins us now. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
You've known her cookbook since you were a child, right?
That's right. Yeah, I grew up with her cookbooks. My parents emigrated from Taiwan, and my grandmother sent copies of Fu Pei-mei's cookbooks to my mom. And as a kid, I'd look through them because they have these great color photographs of dishes. And also, it's bilingual, so it's Chinese and English. So while I couldn't read the Chinese at the time, I could read the English.
What kind of role did Fu Pei-mei's cookbooks play in the lives of some of your neighbors and friends who were also Chinese immigrants in Michigan?
Well, I talked with my aunt and I interviewed her. She's part of the interviews in the book. And she said, if you were a housewife at the time or you wanted to learn anything about Chinese cooking, you had her cookbooks. And in fact, there was a saying at the time that students from Taiwan going overseas would all bring the same two things, a datong electric rice cooker and a copy of Fu Pei-mei's cookbook.
You suggested we play an episode from her long-running television appearances of where Fu Pei-mei prepares squirreled fish, which was her way of talking about how fish puffs up like a squirrel's tail when it's cooked.
然后呢，就给它这个肉再给它片下来。那么黄鱼呢，稍微买的大一点，如果是12个人吃的话，
What was she like on camera?
She was a total professional because she would continue no matter what happened. You know, it was live television at the time. There was no recording. And if she cut herself, if she burnt herself, she just had to keep going. And she did that every single time. And the amazing thing was the way that she was able to talk and cook at the same time. So in that clip that you just played, she is simultaneously telling you what kinds of fish to use in this dish, that this fish or this particular dish is from the Jiangsu region. And if you can't find a yellow croaker, you can use a brown croaker. And at the same time, she is using this huge cleaver to delicately score the fish all the way down to the skin, but not cutting through the skin, so that when she lifts up the fish and shakes it out, it is completely in this delicately cut pattern, but still attached to the skin, so that when you fry it, as you say, in a floured batter, it puffs up and looks like a squirrel's tail. So that she's able to do that in 5 minutes on television is amazing.
What drew her into food? You know, her family background wasn't a food background. And of course, this was following China's Communist Revolution.
That's right. Yeah, she started out her married life not knowing how to cook. And in fact, her husband would criticize her all the time because he would have mahjong buddies come over to play. And she was, as a housewife, was expected to make snacks and things for them. And he would complain and say things like, you know, you're making the same fried rice again. Can't you make anything different? And it was really embarrassing for her. But, you know, she did not know how to cook. She had left mainland China as a teenager after the Civil War. Her mother still lived in China. And there really wasn't a way at that time. There weren't cooking schools. There weren't a lot of cookbooks. She didn't have a way to learn. So she actually hired a series of restaurant chefs to teach her their specialty dishes. And she used her dowry to do so. And over time, she got good enough that the mahjong players said to their own wives, hey, go learn from Fu Pei-mei. And that's how she got her start teaching cooking classes in a tent in her backyard.
How did she become a kind of ambassador of Chinese cuisine, especially in the U.S. and Japan, interestingly?
So she actually was fluent in Japanese because she grew up in Japanese-occupied China during World War II. Her father was a Japanophile. He had an import-export business, and he sent her purposely to a Japanese school, hoping that she would have some kind of international career. So her Japanese was entirely fluent. And in the late 1970s, early 80s, she had a program on Japanese television teaching Japanese housewives how to cook Chinese food. And she, you know, narrated it entirely in Japanese. So she's a, you know, pretty amazing woman. But she also traveled around the world because the government on Taiwan recognized that they had a real talent in Fu Pei-mei, and they would encourage her to appear on morning shows in the United States or to go abroad to do food demonstrations. And so she herself called herself a culinary ambassador for Taiwan.
I gather she welcomed modern improvements, but she kind of drew the line at the microwave?
Yeah, that's right. So she collaborated with tons of food companies and China Airlines to work on their in-flight meals. And she's actually very well known for developing a particular instant ramen flavor packet for unit president food companies.
Forgive me, which has the personal endorsement of our daughters.
Okay. Yes, that particular ramen brand, it was famous because they included not just dry ramen and a dry seasoning powder, but also a packet of actual meat that you would then include into the ramen. And so, yeah, she was totally into technological improvements. And she said something like, you know, for centuries, Chinese people have preserved foods by drying it, by pickling it, by fermenting it, using things like cans and vacuum packaging and retort pouches is just the newest way to preserve food. So she was very much interested in trying to keep Chinese food culture alive for a growing generation of people who just don't cook. But with the microwave, she drew the line. And she said, you know, you just can't control the heat.
Yeah. Is there a dish that's made in kitchens all over the world today that, even if we don't know it, we kind of owe to Fu Pei-mei?
I think there's not probably one dish. One of the reasons people like her first volume cookbook from 1969 so much is that she really covers all the greatest hits. And with Chinese food, there is no one dish. That's part of the beauty of it, that you could eat your way from here to eternity and never eat all the wonderful Chinese dishes there are.
What if I wanted to make something tonight?
I would say try one of the easier stir-fry recipes and start with that, because that's going to be a basic, giving you some chopping experience and some quick frying experience. But I started with the beef and peppers, so that's what I would recommend to start with.
Michelle T. King's new book about the enduring influence of Fu Pei-mei. Chop, fry, watch, learn. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. Let us know what you think. You can write to us at bookoftheday@npr.org. I'm Andrew Limbaugh. The podcast is produced by Isabella Gomez-Sarmiento and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Rena Advani, Katie Klein, Sarah Handel, Noah Caldwell, Corey Antonio Rose, Jessica Placzek, Justine Kennan, Elena Burnett, Jason Fuller, Ashley Brown, William Troop, Todd Munt, Thomas Danielian, Shannon Rhodes, and Fernando Nato Roman. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.
I'm Rachel Martin. After hosting Morning Edition for years, I know that the news can wear you down. So we made a new podcast called Wild Card, where a special deck of cards and a whole bunch of fascinating guests help us sort out what makes life meaningful. It's part game show, part existential deep dive, and it is seriously fun. Join me on Wild Card, wherever you get your podcasts, only from NPR.
This advertisement comes from our paid sponsor, Fundrise. High interest rates mean that real estate assets are available at a discount compared to previous valuations. The Fundrise Flagship Fund plans to expand its billion-dollar real estate portfolio over the next few months. Add the Fundrise Flagship Fund to your portfolio at fundrise.com/NPR. Carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of the fund before investing. Read the prospectus at fundrise.com/flagship.
This message comes from NPR sponsor MassMutual. The Financial Educators Council says 39% of Americans don't have someone to go to for financial advice, but you can plan for the short and long term with someone backed by 170 years of financial expertise at massmutual.com.